you've probably heard me say before, anybody that's paid any attention to the work that I put out, is that I can't find it nowhere in, or I haven't been able to find it nowhere in America where anybody had been treated any way, form, or close form or fashion pertaining to how the founder of the Windmill Ministries have been treated since basically God inspired me or enlightened me or anointed me, whichever category that you want to put it in, going all the way back into the two hands that saved my life, spared my life in 1983. I have come across a show that does remind me a bit towards the imbalances that I was having to face, and this is really about the only way that I know for people to listen to this, and maybe they can get some sort of an ideal of the transformations that I was having to deal with pertaining to dirty cops and dirty political parties here in America that was basically out to literally destroy my life by bringing all kinds of false accusations into my life. So if you don't mind, please listen.
Fatefully, Washington's offer falls through. In August 7th, knowledge of the plot. Fatefully, Washington's offer falls through. In August 1780, Arnold wins command of West Point. The plot is on. For Peggy, Benedict, and the revolution itself, the stakes could not have been higher.
So this is our base map for the Revolutionary War.
To fathom the impact of losing West Point to the American war effort, historian Stephen Brumwell is working with graphic artist Edmund Earle. In 1780, the British hold New York City. The Patriots control the territory to the north in upstate New York. West Point is a bulwark, preventing a British breakout.
If Benedict Arnold had helped the British take over West Point, what would have happened for the rest of the war?
I think it would have had an immense strategic and also psychological impact. There'd always been the notion for the British planners back in London that somehow if you could gain control of the Hudson, you could split the rebel colonies into two sections.
By taking West Point, the British would split the colonies in two and cut off critical supply lines feeding Washington's army.
You can see why this area was described by strategists, most famously George Washington, as the key to the continent. If you could rupture that supply line, you're going to have a dire impact on the survival of the Continental Army, which is already on very short rations in the summer of 1780.
So they are massively reliant on the Hudson, the Continental Army.
To Stephen, there is one more diabolical aspect of this plot that demands consideration.
It was not only about capturing West Point, but there's very strong evidence that the plot also envisaged the capture of George Washington.
Stephen believes the plot is timed to go off during a planned inspection of West Point by General George Washington, ensnaring both the critical Patriot fort and potentially an even bigger prize with the capture of America's greatest leader.
If you take Washington and West Point...
Would that have been the end of the revolution?
Well, it would certainly have been a crisis, a real crisis, and such a crisis as there hadn't been since 1776.
Stephen and Edmund's analysis reveals the conspiracy might well have ended America's struggle for independence, if not for a twist of fate. For more clues, Stephen rejoins historical novelist Forrest Bachner in upstate New York. They're traveling to the scene of the crime, Arnold's headquarters at Beverly Farms, just south of West Point. The investigators are meeting Grace Kennedy. Grace now owns the site of the farmhouse where Arnold's treason came undone in September of 1780. By doing some amateur archaeology, Grace believes she's located Arnold's headquarters.
Wow. So it's pretty deep. That's a lot deeper than I was expecting. And it goes right round underneath as well. Look at that.
That's really some beautiful work down there with that arch.
I know.
The team has unearthed a 17th century spring well and basement. Sure signs of a large farmhouse.
So really, this is hard evidence that there was definitely a building on this site. And that is the Robinson House, where the final act in the treason of Benedict Arnold unfolded.
The plan kicks off on September 20th, 1780. A British sloop sails up the Hudson into Patriot territory, anchoring a few miles south of West Point. In the dead of night, Major John Andre, Peggy's former dance partner and suspected lover, comes ashore. Awaiting him is Benedict Arnold.
Arnold and Andre met in the middle of the night to discuss the final plan.
The meeting should have set in motion the final stages of the plot, but something goes wrong. A Patriot force detects Andre's waiting ship and opens fire. The British sloop retreats downriver, leaving Andre behind.
Andre is stranded behind American lines. So Arnold goes back to West Point and to Peggy, and he leaves Andre with a man named Joshua Hitsmith to get him back to the British lines.
On the road, disguised as a civilian, Andre is stopped by what he takes to be a loyalist force and outs himself as a British officer. But the soldiers turn out to be patriots. Andre is searched and caught red-handed with detailed plans to West Point and other incriminating documents. Word of Andre's capture is immediately sent to both General Washington and the local Patriot commander, Benedict Arnold.
At this point,
You see, it talked about struggling for their independence. It talked also about being the key factor in regards towards what was developing here in the United States. The way that I understand history going into this era is that George Washington was basically a genius whenever it come to them masterminding how that they was going to break away from the British rule, towards him having spies here in the United States that was working with and for George Washington for their independence. Which brings me to another factor. Unless poisonous Putin over in Russia has basically done the exact same thing in making sure that he has, because it's still going on, enforces within the Ukrainian government that would be feeding information back to him. Of course, in today's society now, we don't necessarily have to worry about spies because we've got open media. We got open media that would tell just exactly towards what's happening, when it's happening, and where it's happening. But back then, they had to have certain people that was set up for intel purposes, because if they didn't, they would basically be clueless in what was actually occurring in other parts of the region or other parts of the country. In order to do something and to do it right, and I'm preferring right now towards President Poisonous Putin trying to recapture or take back over Ukraine. In order to do that, you have to have a lot of thinking power involved in how you're going to do it, what you're going to do, where you're going to go, who you're going to trust, and what's the end result. You got to have a plan. And George Washington had that plan. As I said a while ago, out of all the history books that I've ever read, and out of all the movies that I've ever watched, and out of all the stuff that I've been knowledgeable of here in America, other than the genocide of the Indians, there was nothing that I could relate to that would put my situation that I was dealing with towards anything else similar that I had ever read about or studied here in America until I have recently come upon this information. I realize that this is historical information that was available for anybody, but the way that this program breaks it down, it was a slap in the face to me towards Dennis. They basically went through similar type resistance movements back then, struggling for their own independence, the same as you have in regards to In God We Trust. And the reason why I say that on my particular perspective is that America used to be the old America that stood for a holy, righteous God. It wasn't a commercialized God. It wasn't some sort of a universal religion or commercialized religion like it is today. Back then, people stood for the righteousness of God. And because I was trying to uphold that same image, I have been bashed, I have been belittled, I have been demonized, I have been demoralized, I have been in prison because of this, I have been in institutions because of this, I have went through hell, and my family has went through hell simply because of the individual that's speaking to you right now thought that these was in fact the laws, the policy laws that not only did I read about or understand, but that we still today upholded and fulfilled. Especially whenever you get to looking at how the Gulf War originated, and the Bush family and the Cheney family was asked, well, what is your intent here? And they come back and said, well, our intent is to bring stability to the region and to defeat the axis of evil. To bring stability to the region and to bring and to defeat the axis of evil as far as superiority. I had no idea that whenever I stood up for the Lord Jesus Christ, that I was going to get bashed, I was going to get resistance movements, I was going to get all these people that didn't want me to step out into the eyes of society towards me being influential with society. I had no idea that these people was willing to jump through hula hoops just to make sure that they destroyed the very image that I was trying to promote pertaining to a holy, righteous, eternal God. Which speaks volumes about how that this country has went backwards, that at one time this country used to stand for the commandments of God, including thou shalt not kill. But today, this country has idolized the imagery of the righteous, holy God to the point that now they talk about God, okay? They talk about Jesus, but nobody's really, truly willing to submit their heart and life in following after the teachings that the Bible talks about. To where at one time, this great nation used to be a holy, righteous nation. It stood apart from being a greater in righteousness, even more so than Jerusalem, where Israel, where Jesus Christ come from, at one time. Since the Vietnam War, or since World War II, the Korean War, and then the Vietnam War, I have witnessed personally a country that at one time used to be this way, but now is this way. I kind of dial in to the movement towards the core of origin of whenever all that happened. Basically with the assassination of JFK that happened in 1963. Then we had the Beatles movement. Then we had the Elvis Presley movement. Then we had the Woodstock movement. We had the free love movement. We had the birth control movement. We had the equal rights movement with the women's organization. Because in actuality, black people, especially black men, they was allotted towards being able to vote as far as equal rights, the same as white men, way before the white woman here in America ever had that same right. Going back into equal rights, going back even before I ever existed. So by me listening to this and watching this, I draw my own conclusions that this is basically the only thing in comparison to the stuff that I went through pertaining to the corruption of Homeland Security that has already been caught red-handed several different times. As a matter of fact, there was a clash or some sort of a scheme that went on recently about this guy that was imposing as being some sort of a FBI agent that was basically bribing various Secret Service agents into giving them cars and free rent on big apartments and all kinds of stuff like that basically come into an existence one day, and since then I ain't heard nothing else about it. Now that tells you the corruption of our American media and our American government pertaining to whenever something like that is exposed. There was a recent incident that happened up here in Tennessee, the way that the sheriff was disciplining some children. You only heard that once coming from the media, and then after that, they hushed it up. You never heard nothing more about it. And there's been other similar situations that's happened, especially since COVID has unveiled itself. Towards one day you hear this, and the next day you either hear something different or you just don't hear nothing at all. In other words, they put a muzzle on it to the point that it's like a gag order to where you're no longer allowed to mention any about that particular episode. Especially whenever you're talking about Homeland Security, which is basically the main vein or the heart of our United States government, in addition to the media that falls right in behind them in supposed to be telling the truth about various events that happen here in America. Well, they may tell the truth, but if it's too deep of the truth and the truth is going to hurt too much, they're ordered of no longer issuing that information out to the general public, and basically it out of sight, out of mind, and it goes away. There's been lots and lots of stories in America that has went through that same type of proceedings, including what went on in Waco, Texas, in regards towards a bunch of alcohol, tobacco, ATF agents that was plotting of entrapping a group of people that at the time, whenever they was doing that, had no earthly idea that there was any type of immorality, sexual immorality going on the compound. The only thing that they was wanting to do was to stop a group of people that was basically preppers, getting ready for the doomsday, the end of the world, the sky falling. And in doing so, they was stockpiling on food and guns and working together as a unit. And these alcohol, tobacco people, entrap them by selling them guns that, first of all, should have never been sold to the general public. And second of all, these guns, because the type of gun that it was, had at that time a different tax status, that basically the only thing that they could go after the Davidians for at that time was that they had violated some sort of a tax code, a federal tax code, which gave the judge the right of signing a no-knock warrant for the arrest of several different people on the compound with the Davidians. The only problem was they had been had a few hours before that, and they know that they had been had as far as their plans towards infiltrating the compound that day. And rather than them backing off of their plans, they went ahead and pursued it, which basically turned into nothing more than a bloodbath the first day towards the warrant never even making it to the door. Now, the media can get in behind that story, and they can flavor it up any way that they want to flavor it up. And they can bring in all these accusations about, well, David Koresh was having sex with not only wives, but he was having sex with the wives' daughters in there, trying to justify the actions of the ATF and the FBI that, as far as I'm concerned, to this day should be held accountable for their actions towards what they done to that group of people that led, that influenced Nichols and Timothy McVeigh in doing what they done 2 years to the date pertaining to the Oklahoma Federal Building, the bombing of the Federal Building. To this day, there has still not been a proper court that I know of that done the proper and right thing in reprimanding various people with the Texas federal officers that was engaged in not only the shakedown but also in the 51-day standoff. To this day, there has not been accountability issues raised towards the individuals that was part of this scheme towards entrapping a group of people, panhandling on their emotions and panhandling on the people that was, the whole time they was trying to preserve their own lives. And I'm sure within that 51-day period after Koresh had gotten wounded, because of so many different emotions and so many different situations, I'm sure that people was acting in ways that would have not acted in inappropriately towards possibly. Then is whenever some of the women was opening up with their leader that was basically idolizing him to the point of wanting to have sex with him. You take in mind of a situation that dire, being held hostage for 51 days, you're going to have a lot of different opinions with a lot of different emotions that's going to happen within that time period, especially whenever you're talking about 70-something people. You're not talking about one individual. You're not talking about even two individuals. You're not talking about even 3 or 4 individuals. You're talking about a whole group of people that was held hostage for 51 days against their will. There ain't no telling what was going on in their minds. There ain't no telling what that they was thinking. There ain't no telling what that they done that they ordinarily wouldn't have done under those same circumstances, especially with their leader being wounded. It was a horrible situation that the ATF brought upon to a group of people that to this day, as far as I'm concerned, has not been appropriately dealt with by the federal government working through the state of Texas. And they wonder how come that all this stuff has happened to them pertaining to all the drugs coming over the border, and they wonder how come all the illegal aliens has inundated their state pertaining to them coming over the Rio Grande. And just within the past, I guess, 48 hours, I heard where the governor had mandated some sort of a new law that was causing havoc with the supply chains, either coming out of Mexico into America or coming out of America into Mexico, that some of the lines was like 25 miles long, causing truck drivers to run out of fuel and causing them to be delayed on making their schedule proper scheduling on their supplies, that it's just turned into a total chaotic situation. You wonder how come hell has struck the state of Texas? Well, maybe you need to back up and start realizing where the original core of problems began. Especially whenever you have a group of people, the smart people or the rich people in that state, that had been panhandling off of the backs of off of the labor of the wetbacks for years and years and years, towards allowing them to come over to the border illegally and working them for about half the amount of money that they would be out on other labor forces. And now all of a sudden, because they was trickling in it one day, now they're ushering in the next. They don't realize why this has come upon to the people. Well, if they would to stop and ask themselves a couple questions pertaining to what have we been doing in the past 30 plus years that could have formigated or could have instigated this type of problem that has now befallen up into our own home state. For some reason, the people that are supposed to be the smart people, the experts, aren't intelligent enough, I guess, or they just don't want to look at the whole truth pertaining to why that God has allowed for these situations to get out of hand the way that he has. For some reason, even our ministers, our preachers, aren't smart enough to see what is actually going on. You know, I had a woman last night tell me over the phone that that as far as she was concerned, that Mother Nature had become confused. She said that she had seen her trees out in her yard bloom and go out of bloom 3 different times before Easter weekend in the year 2022, which is right now presently the year that I'm talking to you on this program here. She told me that she had seen her trees bud out, getting ready for a full display of greenery, and then get nipped and turn dormant and come out again and get nipped and become dormant 3 different times, and I guess now makes the 4th time that the trees are starting to bud out and they feel comfortable in budding out. So is her analogy correct pertaining to Mother Nature being confused? Absolutely. It's called environmental changes. It's called a global crisis that even to this day is still not being properly looked at in the urgency that it needs to be looked at towards the problems that we're bringing upon to not only ourselves but to other people all over the world. You got to be intelligent enough to go back and do your own little homework and trying to put all the dots together towards trying to figure out where did we go wrong? Where is the core of origin? How did all this come about in our lives? You know, whenever you're doing it on an individual level pertaining to your relationship or business relationship, or something just totally went upside down in comparison to the way that you felt like that it was going to go, most people, if they're going to learn from their lessons, evaluate the situation, and they can figure out, okay, instead of me making a right turn over here, I made a left turn, and because I made a left turn, this occurred, which led into this occurring, that led into this occurring, that basically snowballed, and now has put me in the position that I'm in right now. Most people, if they have any intelligence at all, once they realize that their plans between man and beast sometimes go astray, most people will evaluate themselves and evaluate their moves to be able to discover their discoveries. That way they don't make the same mistake again. Here in America, we don't do that. Why don't we do that? Well, we're not going to admit to any of our wrongs. The government ain't going to admit that they was wrong in how that they handled the investigation pertaining to the Davidians down in Mount Carmel, pretty close to Waco, Texas. We can't come out and admit to those things, because if we do, it's going to shame us. It's going to make us look bad. Well, whenever you no longer live under the policies that my grandmother used to always told me about, that if the shoe fits, wear it, whenever you get to the point that you no longer live by those policies, at that point in time, you're no longer living legitimately. And because you're not living legitimately, odds are you're not going to learn from your mistakes. Because everybody makes mistakes. Everybody learns. As I have said before, we all have imperfections, and the best that any of us can hope for is that our good qualities will outweigh our bad before we actually take our last breath and walk off into eternity. Whenever you have a society of people that no longer wants to function that way, then you have a society of people that is drunken, basically being confused, wish-washy to the right and to the left, and they're never going to be able to come out of the stupor that they're in as long as no one's willing to stop and say, wait a minute, let's go back to the core here. Where did all this start? If you're not willing to want to do that, either as an independent person, or a couple, or a community, or a country, odds are you're probably going to continue to keep making the same mistakes. Now, that advice didn't cost you nothing. Let's listen to some more of what went on during these times that I have personally related to it being very, very similar to my own situations that I have experienced in the past 30, I guess going on now 34 years. But if you go all the way back to 1983, whenever basically a red target was planted on the back of my back, that's whenever I started feeling, experiencing, and being targeted by these evil demonic spirits, because at that point in time they knew that God the Father had saved my life for a particular purpose, and because my life had been spared for a particular purpose, the devil was enraged because the devil did not want me to fulfill my purpose. Satan did not want me to fulfill that in which what God had spared my life over and anointed for me to do to begin with. The same way as Satan did not, working through King Herod, did not want Jesus to fulfill himself, and it wouldn't have mattered if his name was Jesus or John Doe. It wouldn't have mattered if it was a male or female. At that point in time, the evil demonic spirits did not want to see the fulfillment of biblical Bible prophecy come true towards an individual that was going to come into the world, that was going to basically liberate the world because of the sins that the world was committing. And if you get to looking at the sole purpose for God giving the gift to man. That was the whole purpose for the gift. Okay? Because up until that time, before Christ,